Well, Ellen, thank you so much for taking time to be with us today at the Imago Day Summit as we kind of take this period of time to respond to the teachings that's being promulgated at the Association of Certified Biblical Counselors Conference in Louisville, Kentucky this week. You have spent a great deal of time working at the intersection of spirituality and sexuality as a counselor and as somebody who studied these issues for years. Could you just take a little bit of time and let us know your journey, how you got to be where you're at, interested in this particular intersection, and the work that you're doing today?
Yeah, I think it came by a circuitous route. I remember always being interested in gender issues and theology regarding gender issues. Just as a young woman in seminary, almost 30 years ago now in seminary, and feeling a lot of negativity and even harmful things towards me as a woman who was a person who was very interested in theology and pushed out the theological path towards a helping path. The gender issues and the study of that just stayed with me. But while we were in seminary, we were in Dallas. That was in the 1980s during the AIDS crisis, when it first came to light, when we were first understanding this virus. And at the time, I was an RN. My undergraduate degree is in nursing, and I was working in a hospital. And so we were a little bit less afraid being in the hospital because we were a little bit less superstitious and all of that. But what I observed in the Christian community was a complete abandonment of the gay community in terror and in a lot of anger and fear and hostility, where we did not know yet how to treat this virus. We didn't know even how it spread right away. And here we had probably a dozen funerals a week of young men, where it was absolutely heartbreaking. And here are all these terrified young men dying of something they didn't understand, being abandoned by the church, being told that God hated them. This was God's judgment upon them. And something in me at that point turned and thought, this is not the gospel. This is not the gospel of Jesus that I understand. There is something very, very wrong with us targeting this group out of our own fear and deciding that God also rejected them. So that began a shift in my personal journey as far as getting to know God and God's heart for people, and especially those who don't kind of fit the mainstream, which tends to be straight white men, and them getting then to decide who is allowed in and who is not. So that was 30 years ago. It's been a long, slow, circuitous route. Yeah. I'm very grateful for it, but that's kind of how I got here.
Totally. Wow. What a catalyst for this.
Absolutely. To find out who Jesus actually is.
Yeah, totally. And I can only imagine that the experiences that you had in that period, like you said, working with the AIDS community that was so marginalized and so feared, that would, for a Christian paradigm, that should cause us to react. And that's just what an amazing story. That fear that existed in the AIDS crisis still exists to some degree around evangelical and conservative religious types. And I actually think it's probably that similar fear, the unknowing of what causes what is seen as kind of perverted sexuality from this theological perspective, that is creating this movement that we're seeing today, this conference that's addressing transgender identity and homosexuality. And the answers that they're kind of proposing are pretty simplistic, biblical, theological answers. Earlier today, a press conference was held at the conference where they outright rejected conversion therapy, reparative therapy, but said that what they wanted to see and what they were advocating were people coming to Christ and being transformed. And the question that came to my mind is that if we're calling people to come to Christ and be transformed, what does that mean for somebody who is transgender? What does that mean for somebody who identifies as LGBT? Most likely it would mean suppressing sexuality or working to overcome it. As you've worked in your practice for all of these years, What is the effect of that kind of teaching, theological and spiritual, on the LGBT people that sit before you and grew up in these communities and hear that Sunday after Sunday?
Without a doubt, there is extreme self-hatred. And there is a lot of confusion. They find it very, very, very difficult to believe that God can love them just as they are, which is central to the Christian message, that the one who is the lover of our souls loves us unconditionally without the requirement to change anything. God comes to us as we are, is the gospel. We don't earn anything. That gets very, very distorted for them. But the self-hatred is probably the most damaging part, because in their minds they are defective and wrong. Yeah. And that is how I describe shame. Shame controls a lot of their thoughts and emotions.
Yeah. And I think in the religious context, that shame is actually, in a lot of his contexts at least, is promoted as a feeling of conviction.
Yes.
In your own journey with this issue, this has also been a theological journey for you.
Sure.
In that kind of intersection of theology and psychology, how do you explain that shame aspect to, like, if I was sitting in your office as a queer evangelical person, initially I would have said, yeah, I do feel shame, but that is what I'm supposed to feel. Right. How do you deconstruct that?
That's a really good question. Yeah, we do a lot of work on trying to build up what I call the true self. It says in the Psalms that God desires integrity in most places. You know, who you truly are is what God is about. And separating that out from all of the shoulds and all of the voices in our lives that tell us otherwise, that tell us who we can and cannot be, and who we are and who we're not, that God ultimately gets to tell us who we are. So that's the place that I start from. It's like the shame voice does not come from God. We talk about the scriptures where it says, therefore, there is now no condemnation in Christ Jesus. So if this is a condemning voice, that is not from Jesus. So where is that voice coming from? All of that is a foundation to help people begin to tease apart, okay, what is me and what is all of the other stuff that has been put on top of me? How do I tell the difference between conviction and shame? Well, conviction is a true self thing, where you don't lose a sense of yourself. When I say self, and that's a trigger word for evangelicals, because we're all about not having a self. But actually what I think the truth is, we're all about not having an ego. The ego is who we think we are, which has all of the thoughts and opinions and convictions and perceptions and judgments and all of that. That's who we think we are. Right. But there is a self that's deeper than that, that's truer, that is where we commune with God.
Sure.
As we die to ego, which is the part of us that competes with God, we get much more in touch with the true self. And that true self is the part that can feel conviction, that actually then, okay, something is not coming out of my integrity here. Something doesn't fit. That's conviction. Versus shame, which is merely the message that there's something wrong with you.
Right.
That has never, ever come out of Jesus's mouth. There's something wrong with you. You're defective. You're horrible. That is a false message. I'm not sure if that's clear, but that's where we start anyway, working on what is that true person beneath sexuality, beneath all of the religion, beneath all of that stuff.
Yeah, totally. I think that makes a lot of sense. And as I'm sitting here, I'm trying to kind of embody the thought of what a conservative biblical counselor would be thinking as they're listening to this. And again, going back to what we kind of touched on earlier, I feel in myself a lot of fear if my whole theological paradigm is built on this notion that what the Bible clearly states is absolutely true, then I can't accept what psychologists are saying, and I can't accept what the modern findings are. I imagine you've also probably had a good amount of conversations with parents of LGBT kids, and I think it's probably a parallel between their pastors and their parents, the same kind of fear.
Absolutely.
How do you begin to talk to the parent who just can't empathize with their child because their entire faith paradigm that they've built for their entire life sits on this?
Usually when they're at that point, when a parent calls me and they cannot empathize with their child, and they're telling their child all kinds of things, even trying to do it nicely. In love, I'm telling you that you're on the path to hell, that sort of thing. Usually their child is already reacting in a way that's showing them that this isn't working. This is not helping them. They're pulling away from me. They're angry. They're rebelling. They're refusing to come home. They're whatever. So that gives us the basis to say, what if there's a different way to talk to your child? Because they already know how you feel. They already know your theology. You don't need to keep saying that unless you want to continue to push your child away. And almost every parent, now there's a few who will not go there, but almost every parent does not want to lose them. And I reinforce to them, especially if they're young, high school, college, that these kids still need their parents as they struggle what is normal developmentally at that age to figure out their identity. Who am I? They still need a safe space in their parental relationship for that. So if you take that away from them, now they're figuring out on their own. Right. You're the best one to do that, but you can't do that if you are unsafe. So since they already know what you think, no more preaching. If you want to love this child, no more preaching. What you need to give them now is an empathetic space where you basically show them that you understand what they're feeling and saying, and you mirror that back to them. And when it comes time to judge or give advice, you zip your lip. And it's very, 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 very hard. But your child is at stake. If you want to keep them in your life, if you want to keep them from harming themselves, they must know that they have a safe place on earth to come where they are going to be listened to and loved. Otherwise, you will push this child away or you will damage them. You will continue to damage them. And is that what you want? I mean, sometimes we have to get pretty blunt. And whenever they do start doing that, start talking with empathy. Wow, you broke up with your boyfriend. That must be very painful for you. I'm so sorry. Rather than, well, thank God, now God's happy. When they hear empathy from their parents, because it's true, it is painful for them.
Yeah.
You don't have to compromise your beliefs, but you can acknowledge that your child's in pain. That child softens towards that. That child begins, is this for real? Can I trust my mom or my dad again? It does wonderful things.
Yeah. Totally.
Yeah.
And another, I've had a lot of conversations with kind of Southern Baptist leaders, and we continually talk about the link between this theology and its toxicity to things like self-harm and suicide. And a number of them would continue to argue that it's just a fear tactic of the left to say that a theological belief could actually be the catalyst for my child or a congregant committing suicide or harming themselves. Based on what you know and what you've studied, is there actually provable links between kind of conservative religious rhetoric and that condemnation that comes from that and self-harm, mental damage, psychological damage?
Well, I have not done a scientific study, but in my experience with many, many, many clients, that condemning religious voice in their head, which is usually the voice of their churches or their parents, does get in the way of their being able to heal and grow. Yeah. When I say heal, I mean become an integrated, whole, and healthy person.
Right.
There is not a therapy currently, as you're well aware, that can change orientation. It just doesn't exist. So when I talk about healing, that's not what I'm talking about. But there is definitely a connection, because when anybody carries a voice of criticism, a voice of condemnation in their head, they cannot grow. They are stifled by that. They are stunted by that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'll give you one more critique that I hear often. Even in my own journey, a lot of my religious leaders and mentors have said it's a real problem that in this day and age, people are putting their sexuality or gender identity as a qualifier to Christian. So I identify as a queer Christian or a gay Christian or anything like that. And the argument is, in Christian theology, Christ should be our primary identity. Is sexuality and gender identity, are these things that are kind of core identities, or are they something that should have that place of being a qualifier that identifies us in a certain way? Or are they actually lesser identities and perhaps are being made too much of in modern society, as we talk a lot about marriage equality and all of these things as their kind of public interest issues. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think there's like really two questions in there. I think even our core identity is our core dignity as the Imago Dei, as the
Yeah.
image of God. That is our core. Everybody has that core identity, for sure. And then I think the next tile on top of that then would be gender and sexuality, because that is very, very deep. That's not just a surface thing that we choose later on. That's very, very deep, as you know. But I think the problem with having to use it as an identifier is because it's not been welcome. And there is an assumption amongst some parts of the church, not all of the church, that you can't be both a sexual minority and a Christian.
Right.
And which fortunately is not true, at least when you look at Jesus as the lens through which we draw our theology and our interpretation of the scripture. Yeah, so at this point in time, people, I believe, are using that, at least that's been my experience, as a way of saying, I belong too.
Yeah.
I'm a Christian too. This matters to me too. I'm very devoted to God too. And yet you will find this out about me and,
Yeah.
wanting you to know I'm here on the same page with you. We both love God.
Totally.
That's been my perception of it that I've gotten from my clients. It's not a in-your-face thing. It's just, it's me. But honestly, I'm a Christian too.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I love that. And kind of just the last question that I would love to hear your perspective on is, if you had the chance today to step up on that stage in Louisville, Kentucky, in front of all these Southern Baptist biblical counselors, and you had the chance to implore them on this topic, what would be the big thing you would say? What would you want them to know?
I would want to start out by making friends. In other words, I believe their desire is to please God.
Right.
I also do believe that we have shifted the idea of what it means to be a Christian with the idea of fitting a certain mold and a certain morality. And that I believe we've gotten off track from the gospel that Jesus preached.
Right.
Which is really not about that at all. It really is about developing these hearts that empty out of ego and self so that we have room for others and for the care of others, and let go of our ego as far as even our stuff so that we have room to share and to make opportunity for others. It's a heart, when you look at Jesus, that was continually gathering, continually inclusive, continually bringing people in who were cast out by the religious system. That was Jesus. So if we have a psychology that does the opposite of that, a psychology that says, no, you need to measure up to these standards, I think we're doing people a disservice. I don't believe we bring them healing through that. If we can create a safe space in our offices where they can realize that you are loved just as you are, and there is integrity in you that will cause you to do good.
Yeah.
It's not a wrong priority, but it will be within context of the true gospel and not this gospel that tries to make you fit into a very small box.
Right.
Then we serve our clients well. Then we're serving them out of the gospel and not out of an agenda. Right. I understand the theology, but I think we have to be really careful with what we're really hoping for. What is the outcome here? People who look a certain way and behave a certain way, or people who have the magnanimous heart of Christ in them.
Wow. That's so beautiful, honestly. And thank you so much for taking a little bit of your time to be with us. It's so evident that, one, you're overflowing with the love and grace of Christ, but it's also evident that you really are compassionate and care about this issue. And so just thank you for the work that you're doing to help this community reconcile our faith and our sexuality and find the healing and hope that we need. So thank you so much.
You're very welcome. I really think that the gay community is a gift from God. It's going to help us find out how to love again.
Amen.